Blezard, who's going to be looking in particular at how this relates to her work around ageing in the community. So over to you.
Hi, yeah, I'm the other Eve. That's not often that I get to say that, actually. So there are a couple of research projects where I suppose it'll almost feel a little bit like we're saying the same thing, but it's just tying some of the threads together that are quite important and overlapping. That didn't work then, did it? Right. So before I go into the current research project that I'm on, I just wanted to take you back take myself back to some previous research that I've done. In another life, I worked in housing. I was a community development officer, and from that came my PhD research, and that was all about the importance and significance of community, but from a resident perspective on one particular estate. And it was a estate that was going through a lot of regeneration. So the neighbourhood, the built environment was really changing. But there was also quite a lot of social change. And the reason why I wanted to bring it in was because there were so many parallels. And interestingly, when I was having a look at what Ian was saying about what is an active neighbourhood, when the estate was originally designed in the 70s, it was clearly very much designed in that way. It was mapped out to make sure that certain amenities were local and how walkable was the neighbourhood. And that's really changed over the years, particularly with the newer regeneration. So through that work, what we really found, and again, this really echoes what Ian was talking about, is the importance of community and third spaces. They had such a pivotal role for residents. It was the places that they came together. It was the places that they shared with each other. They got to know each other, which was really important for new residents. They engaged with services. They supported each other, and they were really, really important in difficult times. So maybe through COVID, through austerity, through different types of change. But what we found was, because of the regeneration and because of austerity, a lot of those third spaces had gone. They've been lost, they've been changed, they've been reduced in their access. And for residents, they felt that meant that the community had gone. They'd lost the community. And what was also important to them was they weren't just about a space to go and do things. They were very organic spaces that those residents owned and controlled and used and shaped themselves. So it was back to how you use your own neighbourhood, you shape your own neighbourhood. So losing those spaces was sort of like losing a bit of piece of that neighbourhood, a bit of control. Let's see if I can do this without. So what I also want to talk to you about was the research project that I'm working on now. And this is a 2-year project funded by the Dunhill Medical Trust. If I don't get that in, I'm in trouble. It's led by the University of Salford, and our partner institution is Manchester Metropolitan University. And we have a key community stakeholder, which is Inspiring Communities Together. And it's all about understanding, very similar, how do we create inclusive and accessible communities, neighbourhoods and services, but particularly with a focus on how does that support social connections in older people. I use the term older people, which is always contentious. Aging is probably a better term. So what's the research about? So it's about understanding how do people remain socially connected to other people, places, services, neighbourhoods as they age, but particularly in light of COVID-19. So what we'd seen in COVID-19, and particularly in lockdown, those spaces have changed. How we access those spaces have changed. Some of those spaces have been lost. Some of those services have changed and lost. We've had a big digital switch. So what does that mean for inclusive spaces? How will that shape things and change things? And how we want to do that is a very collaborative approach. So it's a co-research approach. So we're bringing members of the community and community stakeholders with us all the way. So that means they'll be involved in data collection, in analysing that data, and in making recommendations and shaping change as well. So how does that tie in with the findings of this interim report? So we've just finished phase 1, which was all about sort of mapping the current provision, but getting out there and doing some focus groups with lots of different community services and agencies and groups. So when I read the interim report for this, there were some things that really sort of stood out. And again, it did go back to those community spaces, those places where we meet, those places where we can run activities. They were really important. They were pivotal to how services were delivered, and lockdown in particular, but COVID-19 has really hit those spaces and how we use those spaces and where they've gone. So when we mapped it, those third spaces that you'll see listed in the interim report were very similar to the spaces that older people use to deliver activities or engage with services or socially connect. So we did see some shifts in what types of community spaces were used, and there was some discovery there, because obviously, especially in lockdown, it forced us all to think differently and interact differently. And what's come out of that is that older people have discovered some new or rediscovered some forgotten spaces. Some of those spaces are digital, and some of those spaces are outdoor spaces. How do you engage maybe more with green spaces and local outdoor spaces so you can sort of socially distance? What we found in terms of stakeholders is that being in those lockdown conditions, and particularly having to have very quick and rapid pandemic responses, made local partners come together a lot more. And I think there was, maybe we're all looking back with rose tinted glasses, but there's that feeling of we all came together. But it really sort of forced people's hands into having to come together and work together a lot more closely. And what that did was make partners pay a lot more attention to the local neighbourhood and think about a locality approach. Okay, so how do we all come together in this locality to deliver services and support in a neighbourhood? But we also saw, like so I was saying earlier, about how it's important for people to have control and claim and access to spaces in their own neighbourhoods. What we saw was some reclaiming of spaces. So you saw the quotes that Ian used earlier about maybe feeling that some spaces are for families, or maybe some spaces feel off limits or inaccessible. We did find some rediscovery, particularly of green and open spaces. So local parks where people might have not gone before, some community activities sort of shifted to that. And I would say the other thing that we found was there's a real sort of drive and an appetite for local people to be much more involved in shaping their neighbourhoods and shaping their services. But how do we do that? What does it look like? And how do we help with sort of research? So we're trying to explore that. What's the balance between involving the community? What's the role for us as researchers? And then what's the role for partners? So how are we going to sort of connect that going forward? How does that tie going forward? And if you look at the interim report, there's quite a lot of sort of recommendations for future work and research that really ties in with what we'll hopefully be doing in the future. And I think that's particularly because, as well as obviously the subject matter, we're looking very much at neighbourhoods being accessible and inclusive, but it's also, hopefully, that participatory approach that we're trying to go for is that we're bringing members of the community into the research. So we will actually be doing a co-research team rather than me just going out and doing it and making sense of it. And that's the key, I think, really. What we're trying to do is put the lived experience front and centre of the project. And that's how we make sense of then how neighbourhoods and spaces can be more accessible and inclusive, and as well as sort of the co-research and the community involvement that we're doing. We have a multi-agency advisory board, so there's quite a lot of partners in there, and that help keeps us in check a little bit. But what we're hoping is, rather than me going off and writing a report over there on the floor, what we're hoping is that during the project we affect change during the project, rather than we do a research project, we write at the end, we write some nice recommendations and off we go. What we're trying to do is try and see some of that change, and what that might look like is a bit of trial and error and experimenting, finding out how do we hear these voices, how do we hear all the voices, the right voices, how do we incorporate this into the research, and how do we affect change that increases the accessibility of communities and neighbourhoods. So that's us before we all pass out in the heat. That's our contact details there. There are, next to the report, just a bit of a pitch. There are leaflets for us there because we're now going into phase 2. So we are actively looking for people 55 and over to come and talk to us about how they connect with their neighbourhood and their places. So yeah, we've got some leaflets. So come and find me. But yeah, you can see lots of parallels as we're going forward.
Brilliant, thank you. Point about learning and adapting as we go is so key, isn't it? We all do. We keep trying to do that.